schedules. Those of that opinion, please say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that vote environment stand part of the schedules.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member Moana Maki. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take a call on vote environment and also the climate change aspects of the environment vote. And I think it's fair to say that environment is going to be one of the major issues of this election campaign. We have a government who has a stated target of doubling agricultural exports by 2025, but at the same time tells us they want to see no further degradation of waterways. Well, I'm sorry, Minister, those two things do not go together. They cannot both happen. So what we have is a government who is happy to oversee further degradation of already very polluted waterways in pursuit of an economic target that will inflict massive environmental damage. It's a short-term sugar fix for people and farmers right now that will mean that potentially future generations will not be able to farm land in the same way that they do right now. That future generations will not be able to benefit from the enormous environmental wealth on which our economy is based. And that's what this debate is about. It's about sustainability. It's not about whether or not we farm, it's about how we farm and where we farm. Because what we know is that we are having land types of extremely vulnerable soils being converted to dairying, lands that leach nutrients very quickly into waterways that are already over-allocated and already polluted. And this minister says that's fine. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment did a report earlier this year where she talked about land use changes. For the first time, she brought together two modelling tools that are well known, that are very credible, so that we could see in 2020 what land use changes would look like and therefore extrapolate from that the impact on waterways. And what that showed was that with the settings the Minister has suggested for the National Objectives Framework on Freshwater Management, that the 2020 worst-case scenario that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment laid out in her report would not be stopped at all. There is nothing in that National Objectives Framework that would stop the worst-case scenario situation from happening. And that is of deep concern to a country that is not only hugely reliant on a healthy environment, because I think government members don't realise without a healthy environment, we don't have a healthy economy. It's not a trade-off between the two. We must protect our environment because without it, we have no economy. It is as simple as that. And it can be done. As I said, this is not about whether we farm. It's about how we farm and it's about where we farm. And that is a discussion that we should be having instead of, unfortunately, a proposed national policy statement on freshwater management and a national objectives framework that will not stop further extreme degradation of our waterways. And Labor has said that we will strengthen the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management. We will bring back the NPS that we suggested when we were in government. We don't want to see any further degradation of our waterways, and we want to see remediation of those waterways that are already polluted. But that's not what this government wants to do. So to compound it, what they've decided is that we need sweeping RMA reforms. Apparently it's the RMA that's holding everything back. This is despite the fact that since 1991, our economy has grown 75% since the RMA was implemented. It's hardly been held back by a piece of legislation which simply requires that the environmental impacts of economic activity are taken into consideration and managed. That's what the RMA does. That's what it's designed to do. It is not and was never meant to be an Economic Development Act. And yet that is what this government wants to turn it into. So the minister says it's failing. That's despite the fact that our economy has grown 75% since the RMA was introduced. Our population has grown 25% since the RMA was introduced. Now, the most recent survey of local authorities in terms of their performance on RMA, now bear in mind the minister says this is a broken system that needs to be fixed. Do you know how many of the 34,000 consents that were processed in the last financial year that was reviewed, and these reviews are done every 2 years, how many were processed on time?
How many?
97%. were processed on time. Do you know how many were approved through the system that the Minister is trying to convince New Zealanders is holding our economy back? 95% were approved. How many were appealed? 0.7%. How many were declined, Mr Chair?
The Honourable Member, Moana Maki.
Thank you. How many were declined? 0.27%. I think you would struggle to find another piece of government legislation that is working as well as the RMA. So Labor agrees there are process improvements that always can be made to the RMA, and we have no issue with that. But we need to leave the basic fundamental values, the heart and soul of the RMA alone. We have 20 years of case law that has been developed. If the Minister thinks that destroying 20 years of case law is going to provide certainty, then she is absolutely off her rocker. It will do nothing more than provide huge uncertainty, environmental degradation, and she hasn't actually shown or proved in any way that there is a problem that needs to be fixed. And the Supreme Court has come to the rescue. In a recent King Salmon case, the Minister had been saying, well, the problem is, you see, the values and the hierarchy of principles in the RMA are being given a higher purpose in law than the national policy statements and planning documents like regional plans and district plans. That's a problem, so we need to amend Part 2 of the RMA. Well, Minister, you don't need to, because the Supreme Court has just completely turned that on its head and said, no, that's not the case. In fact, those planning documents where they use directive language do have precedence over Part 2 of the RMA. So rather than the Minister saying that these are technical changes which will bring the RMA into line with case law and the Minister are now heading very quickly in completely opposite directions. The Minister's other argument is that the RMA is a sacred cow, apparently. A sacred cow that opposition members are saying should never be touched. How ridiculous. I asked the Parliamentary Library to do a search. There is no other piece of legislation since 1991 that has been amended as many times as the RMA. Barely 18 months has gone by without an RMA amendment bill, and that is appropriate. What we need, however, alongside it are the national policy statement and planning documents which can guide the RMA, streamline processes, provide far more central government guidance, and the Supreme Court has now given those planning documents a supremacy that is extremely helpful. I want to quickly come to the issue of climate change before my time runs out, Mr Chair, and just say I'm so disappointed with this government's performance on climate change. This is actually about future-proofing our economy. We have to do this. This is not a nice to have. This is something that we have to do. We have to transition away from our heavy reliance on fossil fuels. The longer we leave it, the more difficult it becomes, the more expensive it becomes, and we miss the amazing opportunities that are out there right now. There are countries around the world that are crying out for low-carbon solutions, crying out for low-carbon goods and services. This is our natural area. This is our natural strength, and what are we doing? Nothing. In 2007, John Key said we need to be ahead of the game on this. We need to realise that we will become trading pariahs if we don't bring agriculture into the scheme, and we need to capitalise on the enormous potential and opportunities for New Zealand as a country that has used to have a very high reputation in this area. And we are being overtaken by countries like Denmark, who are seeing these opportunities and rapidly advancing towards them for the betterment of their economy. The national government says, we want an emissions trading scheme, but we don't want a price on carbon. Well, that's utterly ridiculous. Why would you have an emissions trading scheme, the sole purpose of which is to price carbon, if you don't want a price on carbon? And then they make up some ridiculous figure that it will cost $500 extra a year to have a proper price on carbon. That is utter garbage that has been made up. Because you know what? If they had transparency around carbon pricing and stopped the price gouging that they know is going on by electricity companies and fuel companies that would drop the price of carbon, then actually the overall cost would not be that much to businesses and households at all. And of course what we're doing is incentivising low carbon products by giving them a price advantage. That is the point of a price on carbon. They've allowed cheap units to flood into our emissions trading scheme, collapsing the price of carbon and damaging our forestry sector. This is the one sector that did all the heavy lifting over the last 6 years. The only reason we came out positive in the first commitment period of Kyoto and didn't face a massive bill was because of forestry. Our gross emissions kept going up. We were just planting enough forests to more than mitigate for that. Well, in 2020, those forests come down. And because of the government's climate change policies, we are not replanting the forest. We will face a massive, massive bill. If there is a post-2020 agreement, there is a real risk that it may be unaffordable for New Zealand to enter that agreement if we don't do something about planting more forestry and reducing our gross greenhouse gas emissions right now. Mr Chair, can you imagine how devastating it would be for our reputation if the mess that this government leaves is so bad that actually we have to equivocate on whether or not we are able to enter into a post-2020 agreement. The government's climate change plan, Mr Chair, is 0.4% difference from doing nothing at all.
I call the honourable member Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mr.